You'd think being the holder of an ancient and noble title like the Queen of England would get you absolute control over what happens in this country. You'd think you can just click your fingers and the Prime Minister would legally have to do roly-polies on live TV for your amusement. If someone's on the phone in the quiet coach, you can just have them beheaded. But alas, the UK is not an absolute monarchy like Game of Thrones, where the Queen can just do whatever they want. It's a constitutional monarchy, meaning the monarch has to follow some rules too. Ugh. In fact, the Queen doesn't get to write any laws at all these days. Our laws come from the Houses of Parliament, who are mostly elected. Then they have to go past several readings and committees in both houses before they reach the final stage, which is royal assent. Every bill passed in the UK requires royal assent to actually become law. Basically, the Queen needs to agree to it. So what happens if I just decline? Any proposed legislation I don't like can be stricken from the books. Or I can leave bills languishing without my consent indefinitely, unable to ever become law. I can even use the mere threat of withholding my assent to get lawmakers to change bills I don't like. If I could do that, then I'm not writing the laws myself, but I might as well be. Now, this is the kind of absolute power I'm talking about. But here's the catch. The monarch hasn't actually used this power since 1708. On the throne is Queen Anne, and the legislation before her is the Scottish Militia Bill. But she doesn't withhold assent because she doesn't like the bill and wants to thwart her elected ministers. Her ministers actually ask her to do it because they change their mind at the last minute. Basically, the bill is supposed to provide weapons and equipment for a Scottish militia, but on the day it's supposed to be signed, news comes that French ships have been spotted sailing towards Scotland, planning on invasion. And suddenly, Anne's ministers get very nervous about sending the Scots weapons in case they join the French against England. So they quickly tell her, actually, can we hang fire on that one? Maybe we made a mistake. So she uses her veto power for the last time. It's now been 300 years since the Scottish Militia Bill. So why has no monarch withheld assent since? Well, despite a whopping 17 pregnancies, Queen Anne dies without an heir. Now, Parliament has spent the last 20 or 30 years trying to make sure we don't get a Catholic on the throne, and even raising armies to keep them off. So they desperately fish around for someone, anyone related to her with a Protestant upbringing, and they settle on this guy, the ruler of the electorate of Brunswick-Lüneburg. He becomes George I, and he moves here to his new country, but he doesn't really know British politics, and he's not very confident speaking English, so he mostly delegates the actual political work to one of his ministers, a guy called Robert Walpole, who takes over this work so completely that historians now call him the first Prime Minister. By the time we get a king who can speak English again, the system is running fine without him, and there's not much he needs to do. Instead, later monarchs influence the law in other ways, by giving their favourites the most powerful jobs, by offering peerages and invitations to court. If you've seen The Crown, you'll know that the Queen and the PM have a private meeting every Wednesday where they fill her in on what's happening, and she is allowed, in the words of constitutional scholar Walter Bagehot, to be consulted, to encourage, and to warn. Normally the PM actually goes to Buckingham Palace, but during the pandemic they've had phone calls instead. She's seen 14 Prime Ministers at this point, and she has a lot of experience that they can draw on. These meetings are totally private, so we don't know what is said. But any lobbyist would kill to have that much influence and regular access to the PM. And although stories of times when we know she has used this influence to change a particular bill are rare, one was uncovered by a Guardian investigation in 2021. Basically, the money that the Queen gets from the taxpayer is accounted for, but we don't know for certain how much money the Queen actually has already. what companies she has investments in, or what buildings she owns privately. If you abolished the monarchy tomorrow, although she would lose all the official crown land she owns as the Queen, which is a lot, she would still be a very wealthy woman from all the investments and land she owns privately as rich Lady Elizabeth Windsor, which she doesn't have to disclose to anyone. In the 1970s, there was a bill going through Parliament that would make all investments, not just the Queen's, more transparent, so that investors can't buy shares through shell companies while hiding that they are really the owner. So the Queen's private lawyer, a man called Matthew Farrer, went to meet civil servants working for the government and basically told them that the Queen didn't want her private investments or their value to be revealed because it would be embarrassing or controversial. And what were they going to do about it? In the end, the government made an exception, so that companies who have the Queen as a shareholder don't have to tell anyone. And although in the UK royal assent hasn't been withheld since 1708, it has happened since outside the UK. For example, there are places like Australia and Canada where the Queen is head of state. Now, the Queen doesn't actually look at bills from these countries. I'm guessing because in the days before email, it would have taken too long to send a copy all the way to Britain and wait for a reply. So instead, the Queen has a representative in each of these countries that does the royal assent part for her. And again, the representative withholding assent to a bill is really rare, but it has happened. In Alberta, in Canada, in 1937, 3 bills were struck down by the local lieutenant governor. 2 of them were about giving the local government control over banks, and 1 of them would have forced newspapers to print government rebuttals to stories the government didn't like. The lieutenant governor, a guy called John C. Bowen, withheld his consent for all of them, and indeed all 3 were later found to be unconstitutional. In Australia, this has actually happened as recently as 2001. Although, like Queen Anne, this is a real technicality. Basically, a bill accidentally skipped a stage in the process of becoming law, and the Senate had never actually passed it. So once the Governor-General realised, he revoked his assent until the bill could go back through the proper channels, and he assents to that version. So, what is the point of a power you can't use? What would happen if the Queen were to start using it again? Well, of course she can use it if she wants, but most European countries have got rid of their monarchies in favour of an elected head of state. The number of monarchs in the world is dwindling. Now, despite what leftist Twitter would have you believe, the Queen is immensely popular in Britain, with polls by YouGov showing 72% of the British public have a positive opinion of her, as opposed to less than 40% for literally any other Conservative or Labour politician. If she were to start taking sides in politics, how long would that last? The palace famously never speaks about the Queen's opinions on politics. Of course, simply being a queen is inherently very political. But in terms of day-to-day headlines, we don't know what she thinks about Brexit, or railway privatisation, or legalising euthanasia. Newspapers will sometimes pretend they know, but they don't. She hasn't even attended a Prime Minister's funeral since the 1960s. It is considered utterly forbidden, unthinkable, for a British politician to drag the Queen into politics, to force her to choose a side or make a statement. Because when the Queen says nothing, you can pretend she's on your side, or at least not against you. But if she reveals her politics by picking and choosing which bills become law, she will suddenly find herself with enemies. So, of course, she could use her power if she wants. But will any bill ever be worth the cost? I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to my patrons who are supporting me while I make these videos. You can see their names on the screen right now. And if you'd like to join them, you can visit patreon.com/jdraperlondon, where I post behind the scenes photos and I talk about what I've been reading in my research. If you want more regular history hits, you can find me on TikTok, where I post snippets of cool things I found in London several times a week. And most excitingly, I am now doing tours, so you can come round London with me. Now, I have 3 tours out at the moment, one on Covent Garden, One where we do a brief history of the entire of London in about 2 hours. And the very newest one, Gruesome Tales for Grown-Ups, which, if you like horrible histories, you will definitely be interested in. You can find a link to book tickets for all of those in the description, and I will see you very soon.